Friends in Christ, welcome to Sister Churches 101, a series of educational ecumenical programs that cover what the person in the pew needs to know about Orthodox Catholic relations and dialogue. Through this series of interviews, a group of summary questions with church leaders, and detailed questions with theologians and ecumenists, we hope to raise the awareness of the current Orthodox Catholic ecumenical dialogue and educate laity and diocesan clergy on the history, misunderstandings, and issues on which we agree and disagree. This is the fourth summary question. How did we get to our current separation after 2,000 years of history?
Well, I can't say that we are too much separated. We are more united than in the past time. We are more united now, and that is what the new Saint John 23rd, he said, what united us is much, much more as what separated us. Even the question of Pope is no more so difficult as it was before, I think, because we have so many things together, so many meetings, gathering there and there, so we are in many things united. Therefore, we enjoy our unity and we work for more unity.
We often think, and I think this is true when we were studying church history, as you have pointed out, we're talking about a 2,000-year-old institution, and when we're studying it, we tend to study it in sound bites. And often we go back to the 11th century in the break. But I think there's a bigger picture. I think what happened was a lack of communications that was just a part of the life and structure of life on this planet in those days. We're so used to telephones, to cell phones, to text messaging, to instant communication. In those days, it simply wasn't there. And I think because of lack of communication, both the Eastern and the Western experience of church, manifestation of church, began simply to move in different directions. And it wasn't as if they were antagonistic to each other. They simply weren't talking to each other with any great regularity because it was impossible. And the result was that many times the politics of the moment, the local political situation, began to impact on all of us. And I think there's probably enough blame to go around for everyone. But because there wasn't the level of communication and the level of affective relationship that normally takes place when you're communicating regularly, what should have been easily resolved issues became major ones. And that led to the breaking apart. But even in the separation, the things that are truly foundational to the faith life of the Church are identical for both of us.
Metropolitan Sabodan simply remembered that the Church began as one, became instructed over the centuries by differences in language, culture, politics, and so forth, which ultimately led to schism between East and West. Several attempts at reunion were made, to more and less success, and in some cases partial reunions have led to further divisions. But in the last 50 or 100 years or so, we have all recognized the need for unity and are now working toward that goal.
History. With Protestants, it's a question of rereading doctrine. With Orthodox, it is to some extent, but it's more a question of rereading history together and healing the historical hurts. We remember different things, and we choose to forget different things. The Orthodox remember the Fourth Crusade's attack on Constantinople in 1204. They forget that the Patriarch had torn down all the Latin churches in Constantinople 20 years before and had attacked the Franks, as they call the Latin Church. So we remember what the Orthodox don't remember, and we forget what they don't forget, and consequently we have to heal the memories. There are a lot of things you can go back and say, well, this was unfortunate, but it's not insuperable. Some of the gradual distancing came about because the Eastern Emperor, the Byzantine Emperor, wasn't able any longer to defend the Western Church against the barbarian invasions. So they created a Western Holy Roman Empire, which was an affront to the Eastern Empire, but necessary to protect the Christians because the Eastern Empire couldn't protect them any longer. And that's how we would look at it anyway. But it was an expedient. It didn't have the kind of divine qualities or protection that the Eastern Empire had. And so the Pope assumed a role that the Patriarch didn't, because the Emperor was still there in the East. So there are all kinds of historical things, the forgetting in the west of the Greek language. Very few, knew Greek well enough to not only understand the New Testament, but to read the Greek fathers, the great fathers of the Church, who were all, most of them anyway, were Greek, Greek speakers. And at the contrary also, Latin ceased to be used, even though the Byzantines called themselves Romans. So there was a cultural divide that grew ever stronger, and that prepared the way for the religious separation, as culture often does. We go with our culture instead of with our faith. And there were attempts often enough to keep bridging the gap. We remember certain dates, 1054, but that wasn't regarded as absolutely definitive at the time. People had excommunicated each other, then they unexcommunicated each other. And I don't think at the time it was regarded as the beginning of an irreparable breach that it has become. But nonetheless, we have to go back to the history, go back, and I think we're at a moment in the development of the human race in a global society when we're far more accepting of cultural differences than we were before. And if we can separate out the culture and the faith, I think we're prepared to do that, and hope that we can do it in the future.
Sometimes church separations happen quite quickly. That was the case with the Reformation in the 16th century. The division came to pass in 30 years or less. We can date exactly how it started. We can trace out the stages very clearly. The division between the Latin West and the Greek East, between Rome and Orthodoxy, is not exactly of that type. It happened very slowly, over a number of centuries. There was a gradual process of estrangement. The two sides became strangers to one another before there was a full breach in communion. And it isn't easy to ascribe a single cause to the division between East and West. It was a slow growing apart. In the first 3 centuries of the Christian world, in the first 3 centuries of Christian history, the Roman Empire held together the Mediterranean. St. Paul could travel with relative freedom all through the different parts of the Roman Empire preaching Christ. But from the 4th century onwards, the empire began to split into two, the East and the West. Then came the barbarian invasions. The Western Empire collapsed. Then came, in the 7th century, the expansion of Islam. The Arabs gained control of the sea. Travel became much more difficult. In the first 3 centuries, many people spoke both Greek and Latin, but that wasn't the case as generations passed. There were language difficulties. So one can see a whole series of political and cultural factors that tend to draw Christians apart, that tend to create a division between East and West. But that need not have led to a church separation. Christians can exist in very different social contexts and can still be united. In the course of the division between East and West, there were also theological reasons. the two main factors have been a misunderstanding over the procession of the Holy Spirit. Does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father only, as the Greek East maintained, or does he proceed from the Father and the Son? That was the most important theological difference, about which there were interminable discussions in the period between the 9th and the 15th century. But the second factor, in my view, was more decisive. What is the position of the Pope within the universal Church? What kind of ministry does the Bishop of Rome have in regard to the whole body of Christendom? More specifically, does he have direct power of jurisdiction within the Christian East? This, I believe, was the basic reason for the division. A misunderstanding, or a difference of understanding rather, between East and West over the role and ministry of the papacy. And that still remains, in my view, the main problem today.
I think it is our sins. It is our sins that made this division possible and have actually been the cause of that division. Human ambition, overemphasis of certain human traditions, and things like this. One could make this a long list of human sins which have contributed to the division. Because there is no other reason. There is no reason justifying the division of the Church of Christ. It is our sins, our carelessness about the will of God, our, I would say, a very imperfect fulfillment of divine commandments, which made it possible that the Church would be divided as it is now.
I think it's important to remember that if we look at the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles and so on and so forth, and then the early Church Fathers, the Church, part of the mystery of the Church is the bride of Christ is a mystery of freedom. And that is that the Lord gave us all the graces and things to remain faithful to His command and to live out in our lives and to be a light for the nations. However, there's always had to have been a little bit of kind of discussion and reshuffling and settling in terms of these things. As I mentioned, the Council of Jerusalem before. But from then on, we see for the first, let's say, 700 years of the Church's life, that the Church, whether it was in Byzantium or in Rome, East or West, North Africa, again and again the Church came together to settle certain issues and to make sure that we were faithful to the teaching which came to us from the apostles. And it seemed as though at a certain point, not that people willfully necessarily, especially in the case of the Orthodox, went their own way, but we just sort of drifted apart. I was reading a kind of a commentary on the preparations for the great Pan-Orthodox Ecumenical Council, which has been in preparation for 50-some years. And one of the things that, this was an article that was published in French of Metropolitan Hilarians from Moscow, and he said, you know, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not we should make the effort to have another ecumenical council. There are people who say that the first 7 were enough. They answered everything, and that we've gotten along fine for 1,300 years without a council. But the point is that in saying that, in a lot of ways you explain, you know, how we've gotten to where we're at. And that is in some way or another, the will to engagement between Orthodox, especially Byzantine Orthodox, and the Latin Church somehow it got slack, or it got lack. You know, the attempts were made in the 1400s with Florence to try again with the thing. But in some way or another, we've just kind of grown apart.
So it's certain that there are so many factors that contributed to this moment, and it's involved history, economy, human power, and all these factors that are not so, let's say, ecclesiastical, but also the ecclesiastical structures were in. I think also what is important, that the reality in Orient and the reality in what we call Occident had a different history, different development. And so we know also from the fathers of the church that they had different views of theology, of the Christian theology, like the Antiochian school and the Alexandria school, but it was the same church. It caused no problem. My perception on history is that the real problem was when they got this idea to get separated, because till that moment it was not an existence without different opinions or different decisions, but they could somehow collaborate, also nevertheless having these differences. So the big problem is when they decided to take this separation, and this is a step that has to be healed somehow. In concrete steps, the history, we know the history. For our church in Romania, the problem that I think we have now as Greek Catholic community and Orthodox Romanian community is the interpretation of that union with Rome from 1700 as a breaking from the Orthodox Church reality, or against the Romanian Orthodox Church. But I think this is a problem of reading the history with the eyes of that time, not of this time. Because if we try to interpret the history with the eyes of this period of time, it's very hard to get to a point. So in 1700, I don't think that in Romania, I'm speaking not at the world level, I don't think that the problem between Catholics and Orthodox, as we say now, was so strong, and the problem was not mainly to throw out the Orthodox, but to save the Christian faith. And this is the common problem for today. If we want to save the Christian faith, we have to be together. Otherwise, they will find us separately. We will fight with our weapons, but the army will be divided. So the force of this army is not the same. So my understanding of history is that we have to look at history with a normal eye, without judging history. History is past, finito. Now we have to look to the future, and not to make some mistakes of the past greater than they were. Past is past, let's go and work for the future.
The schism between the two churches is the result of a gradual process of alienation. We actually probably cannot pinpoint the exact date when the division takes place. Historians have identified a number of dates, but when we look at those dates, we say, well, something happened then, but we really can't look upon those dates as being definitive, as kind of being the final sign of brokenness. So we'd say it's a gradual process of breaking the relationship, which takes place over centuries, compounded by political issues, cultural issues, linguistic issues. So as a consequence, by the time we reach the 15th century, both churches recognize that something's wrong, that division has taken place over the course of time.
How did we get here is the next question. That's a toughie. And I'm sure that other speakers on this program can articulate that much more readily than I. But I think it's a lot of little misunderstandings that have been blown up over the years. Partially simply because people don't understand the other tradition. Why don't you do this? I can remember, explaining to people over the years, about the season of Lent. I said, in our Roman Catholic tradition, Latin Catholic tradition, when I was a kid, less so now, but go to Mass every day. What do you do in the Eastern Church? No, you abstain from the Eucharist because that's the greatest of God's gifts. And I could imagine two kids, an Orthodox kid or an Eastern Christian youngster, say 12-year-old, and a Latin Christian. Well, why don't you keep Lent? Why aren't you in church going to Mass every day? Well, why don't you keep Lent? You're supposed to have. It could be a very simple thing like that. And there were two different ways, obviously, of celebrating Lent and trying to grasp it. But you don't understand, one another. It sort of reminds me of a young couple I counseled once years ago when before I really got full-time into academics, and the big battle they had about the Christmas tree. And the battle was that in her family, and I think I've got it straight, in her family they always trimmed the tree, or they always put white lights on the Christmas tree. And his family always had colored lights. And he said, well, it's not Christmas unless there's several strings of colored lights on the tree. And when they put the color, well, that's not Christmas. Well, finally, they compromise, and one year this, one year the other. But it's just different traditions. And you grow up with a tradition, well, it's not Christmas unless I got this particular kinds of lights on the tree. And I think those are only homey little things, but I think it's some of those battles, are simply due to plain misunderstanding, which then becomes, a focal point, a battle cry. Obviously, over the course of the years, and those who are far more adept at church history than I, know how politics get involved in it. Politics both in terms of the emperor and that kind of thing, but also self-serving hierarchs who like their position of power and not going to compromise on this issue or another issue. But I would leave the details of that to people who are more adept than myself. But I certainly would be naive to say that there weren't some egos and political issues which have nothing to do with Christianity in and of itself, that are involved. I mean, certainly we had that, and what is sometimes called the Great Schism of the West with Martin Luther and so forth, and the Anglican Communion. That was as much politics as it was, theology, and we're very fortunate now in the Latin Church that there's some steps being made in ecumenism that will overcome that. I mean, just a few months ago, I should say now, I was invited to participate in a book panel discussion at Lipscomb College in Nashville, Tennessee, and several of my colleagues and some people I know in Nashville said, well, 20 years ago, they would have thought you were the devil incarnate, because they wouldn't let a Roman Catholic into the building, let alone a Roman Catholic priest. But there are steps to be taken, and I think that's also true in the unity of the churches, and it has to begin small and big. If it starts just top down, I don't think it's going to happen. If it starts just on the bottom up, unless there's a major groundswell, it won't happen either. Because those in power, and I won't speak of those particularly today in power, but people don't like to give up power. I mean, we know that. Most families have had the situation where you have to take the car keys away from mom and dad, and they don't want to lose their independence. But there comes a time, 70, 80, maybe even 90, where the reactions are slow, their eyes aren't good, and you're a danger to yourself and everybody else. And they don't want to give up that power of independence. And that's a function, a factor, I should say. It a function because it operates, within the church.
First millennium we were together in full communion, Church of the West and Church of the East, and both churches have apostolic tradition. But then, of course, history comes up, and politics comes in. I just recently read an article describes religious situation in the world, and Western Europe is the least religious part of the world right now, where other parts of the world faith grows, different kind of faith. And the explanation was very simple. Church was too affiliated with the governments in Western Europe. As soon as government fails, people blame church as a part of the government, etc., and the result is obvious. And of course, tragic history of the Christian East under the occupation, under the atheistic regimes in 20th century, wiped out theology, education of the Eastern churches, and basic survival was the just requirement, necessity, and we did not leave any opportunity to proceed unity at full extent.
Well, first off, I have to say I'm not a historical theologian, so I could very well just be totally wrong here. Well, as I understand it, as of course we all know that the church, up until even the founding of Constantinople, was primarily Eastern. 3 of the liturgical centers were in the East, and we had Rome, and then Byzantium becomes Constantinople, and we pick up the 5th. And then we have really the division begins with this movement of the Roman Empire to the east, the seat of it, and now the Vatican. Rome becomes, in a way, a city-state that has to wall herself off. She's mendicant. She goes and preaches the gospel. She sends people out. But she has to be her own kind of city-state. Right now we have the papal states and all these things. Where in the East, there was always this relationship with Caesar, in a way. And
as I understand it, it really, I mean, there were theological differences, obviously, but I think that a lot of it came down to politics. The fact that whenever the church has gotten too close either to being the power or being too close to power because of whatever necessity, and sometimes out of necessity of survival in a way even, I think that's when we run into trouble. I think probably the greatest gift that the Lord gave to the Catholic Church is when the papal states were taken away from the Pope. Why? Now he's a moral voice. He doesn't have interests other than proclaiming the truth to the world. And so as the distance grew longer and the political differences grew greater, and then of course there were exacerbating theological problems, that, you know, as I find and I read more modern types of things, I think sometimes it's just simply, it comes a lot down to misunderstanding. I think there needs to be a hearing in charity. If you really listen to somebody connatural or in a congenial manner, out of love, you hear them as they're trying to express themselves rather than already having a polemical attitude towards what they're saying. Or trying to take them and understand them as they understand themselves rather than already forming the arguments to tell them they're wrong. And I'm not saying that hasn't been done. I don't want to, because there's much greater men than I that have spoken about these things. But I think that difference in lifestyle, that difference in approach, the difference of, and of course there's sin. I mean, let's face it. We can't just make this all kind of this heady, haughty, well, you know, this little thing. It was men with pride. It was men that had superiority complexes that thought what I had is a lot better than yours and you're wrong, and even whether they're proven wrong or not, it doesn't matter because I just think I'm better than you are. You know. And we see that even, I think even now, that sometimes we like to think of ourselves greater than we are. And so, as I understand, really the theological issues have been largely understood and taken care of. Of course, you can still certainly say that the Eastern approach and the Western approach are different. You know, and for you might even think that the approach for your spirituality and the way you're approaching is even better in a way, but they're equally valid. And I think that's a particular burden that the Eastern Catholic Church has had to deal with already. We've been kind of dealing with these issues for now 400 years of how do we make this, how do we be in union and still reconcile the fact that these things are very different. And but in the end, it's like climbing a mountain. You know, you go up the north face, you go up the south face. Where do you get? To the top, right? And that's where we're headed. So I in my very rudimentary way, I think that now, what the solution is now, is love. The fact of going back and saying, no matter what happened yesterday, the Lord calls us to be united today. And out of our love for him and our love for you, brother, who receive the same Eucharist as I do, then I'm going to lay down my life for you. And I've got to take a totally different approach to you than maybe in the past when we were being more antagonistic about the whole thing.
You know, Vatican II says that we've arrived through this historical process at a situation which we know is contrary to the Lord's will of unity for his followers. Quote, there were people often enough on both sides to blame. And that's really true. And those who have inherited, we who have grown up in this situation that comes to us from history, we have to deal with it. And in a way, not dealing with it is a form of, if you like, acquiescence to it. So that's not an option. How did we get here? I would say we got here through an absolutely critically important cultural development. When I say that it's so critically important, I really can't underestimate how important it is, because so many of us understand our relationship with the Lord through our identity. We originally come to it through understanding who we are, where we come from, our family, our ethnicity, our history, our past. So, when that past includes a cultural development, as a Greek, as a Russian, as an Italian, as a Spaniard, as a you name it, when that cultural development includes events like the sack of Constantinople in 1204, or the long periods when it was exceedingly difficult to travel between the Eastern Roman Empire and what was left of the Roman, the Western Latin Roman Empire, say from the time of the sack of Rome in 451 up until, you had really, really safe passage through the Mediterranean, which, when did that even happen? 1700, 1800. So these cultural events caused our cultures, these historical events caused our cultures to develop separately in East and West. And unfortunately, the result is it becomes much harder for us to really know each other, and we need to reacquaint ourselves with each other, not as what we were, but as who we are.
As a historian, I think I see this a little differently. Of course, there are always issues. When people live together, you always have things you argue about. I'm chairperson of a department. We certainly, of 12, and we have lively conversations and disagree about many things. So, and we live in one building. When you think about 2,000 years of history and you think about how big a world the globe really is, one thing that should always have in your mind is that people live in different historical circumstances. Right now, if you are a Christian in North America, that's very different from being a Christian in the Middle East or being a Christian in Africa. Your needs as a Christian are different in those circumstances than they are here. And as a historian, I would have to say that in my view, as someone who studied a lot of the controversies between our churches, a lot of the doctrinal issues, the church councils, whatever you want to look at, I keep coming back to how very different the histories are for the Christians in Europe and the Christians in the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Christians who, from the 7th century until now, have lived as a minority under Islamic domination. Christians living in what is now Greece and Turkey, the Byzantine Empire, the Christians of Russia. These are drastically different historical circumstances than the Christians of Europe had. And, the fastest way to understand Catholic and Orthodox when I'm just doing, I've got 3 seconds to explain this to a class is Catholics are in Europe, Orthodox are the Eastern Mediterranean and the North, and points east. And then we take it from there. In the beginning, of course, Christianity begins in Palestine. It begins in Jerusalem. That's one place, that's a circumstance of a new religion in a situation of political warfare and domination as Rome is seeking to establish its governance over the region. As Christians begin to grow, what language do you speak? The Roman Empire covered from Britain to Persia. That's a vast map. How many hundreds of languages are spoken in that map? Sometimes I tell my students without the Roman Empire we wouldn't have Christianity because the Romans built roads and they gave a common language and a common culture. In the beginning of Christianity, that's Greek. That's not the language Jesus knew. That's the language that the empire used in the beginning, certainly in its eastern part. As Christianity spread, as Latin becomes stronger, as the Roman Empire splits, as you get different kingdoms and states, different empires, people are speaking different languages. And not only are they speaking different languages, sometimes their kingdoms or their empires are at war with each other, or they don't have trade agreements, or they do have trade agreements. Quite literally, Can you talk to somebody in a different language if you don't know their language and they don't know yours? As the Latin West becomes genuinely politically separated, it becomes harder for Christians to talk to each other. How are they going to do it? What circumstances would even bring them together to talk to each other? And when the only circumstances bringing Latin Christians together with Byzantine Christians, when the only circumstances are kings or patriarchs or war, crusades, people at the top, then you're not dealing with life in the parish. You're not dealing with Christian communities. You're dealing with politicians who need arguing points.
Disunity occurs in the church first and foremost because of our fallen human nature. There have always been disagreements in the church. You go back to New Testament times. The problem is that the separation that exists today between Orthodoxy and Catholicism is a separation that has lasted way too long. It's one thing to have a schism for a couple of months, maybe a couple of years, maybe even a couple of decades. And that would happen. You know, it happened in the case of the eastern half of the Roman Empire and the western half of the Roman Empire during different centuries in the first millennium. But the church found a way to heal those wounds. What in essence happened that really solidified the break was the sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade in the year 1204. Now, people say, well, hold on, what about 1054? What about even before that? You know, you had Photius and the Pope, etc., the disagreements. Even 1054, the excommunication by Cardinal Humbert of Patriarch Michael Cerularius, that did not really bring about the kind of comprehensive separation that we frequently imagine. And quite frankly, even after the sack of Constantinople, there were parts of East and West where they were still getting along. They were still receiving, at each other's altars. In fact, quite technically, if we're going to be really technical about this, the absolute total ban on intercommunion between Orthodox and Catholics in a more comprehensive and definitive way didn't come about until the early 18th century, because there were instances where you still had people receiving, at each other's altars, as it were, granted by way of exception, but it was happening. So, in essence, what this is all about is a horrific event that causes the devastation of what at that time was certainly the most glorious city in all of Christendom by, quote-unquote, fellow Christians. And that kind of thing you don't forget easily. Now, it would be really wonderful, it would be quite appropriate if Christians of the Eastern Orthodox tradition could say, well, okay, that happened, we forgive. And quite frankly, they're obliged to say, okay, it happened, we forgive, let's move on. But in response to the question, how did we get here, that actually is the most direct answer. Because, once you've had someone who claims to be a fellow Christian massacring, your nuns, raping women on your street, destroying buildings, desecrating altars, etc., that's the point at which it's hard to continue believing that you and they belong to the same church, that you are in fact both Christians.
I keep thinking of the Fourth Crusade and the documents that have come out of the Fourth Crusade and the Crusaders with the crosses on their shoulders, the crosses on their shirts, their uniforms, and how impossible it was for the people, the Byzantines, to understand what was going on. There was no place, there was no way to understand that. It was completely and totally incomprehensible. And it's fueled so much of the anger and the frustration, that inconsistency there. And I guess it speaks to the wider issue of the Crusades and the purpose of the Crusades. I understand that. But what happened in Constantinople, it really affected the basic psychology, I think, for many Greek Orthodox. And the distrust that has emerged as a result of that confusion. And it's all understandable, of course, It was confusing. And why would you trust someone who has a uniform that says one thing and does another thing? That inconsistency has just been a source of mistrust for a long time. And once the seeds of mistrust are planted, they are so hard to uproot, so hard to uproot. And when I think about the continued separation, it really, the basis of it is this mistrust. And so while we can work out a lot of theological pieces, we do need to get to the root cause of the mistrust in order to really move ahead, I think. But when I think of how do we get there? Mistrust. Justifiable mistrust. It's so hard to move beyond it.
Well, first and foremost, I think it's one of the fruits of original sin. From original sin, the heart of man is divided. We're divided within each other. Between husband and wife get divided, families get divided, friends get divided, nations get divided, and the church gets divided as well. So first and foremost, once again, like we were saying before, unity is of God. Disunity is diabolical. In other words, it is not of God. It is of evil. And so it's certainly an offshoot of original sin. But in particular ways, it has a lot to do with this sense of me versus them, of a lack of sense of community. Like, it's what I believe, or my friends, or my little group, we are together in this kind of thinking around this maybe kind of person or church, whatever, and it's us over here and those people over there. So it's kind of a breakdown or a lack of this sense of the universality of belief and of the church.
Much the same way as any divide happens within a family, little differences escalated into larger differences that became divides. Some of them are pretty practical and basic if you just look historically. Geography was one reason. The church started in 5 different centers, 4 of them being in the east and 1 of them being in the west. So you started evolving where you had half the church speaking the Greek language, half the church speaking the Latin language. Over time, that created a divide. You also had some doctrinal difference, and you didn't have the benefit of the internet or texting or other modes of communication to work through them before they became issues. For example, in our creed, the Roman Catholic creed says that the Holy Spirit emanates from the Father and the Son. The Eastern says that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. That became a very large difference as the truth of the Trinity became, or the nature of God became a major debate. Again, there was no way to communicate that effectively real time to work through those problems before they escalated into major issues. There's also some other things in history that happened. The East was mostly under repression or oppression. Muslim or atheistic regimes where the Eastern Church was trying to flourish. So they had a bit of a survival issue going on. The Western Church flourished in better conditions. So that also led to different divides. You had institutional issues as well. You had agendas of leaders, the typical stuff you get in any organization that created divides, as sometimes the truth and the purpose of the church was compromised by individual agenda. But I would like to say this, because those are some of the reasons we divided. But by and large, the church has been a wonderful institution that's produced hospitals, orphanage, academia, social justice, all that is an outflow of the love of Christ. So when we talk about these divides and how we got to where we are today, we're focusing on some of the negative, but we shouldn't lose sight on the positive. And as one famous saint is always quoted as saying, we have to remember the church is not a place, a museum for the saints. It's a hospital for the sick. It's where we all need to work through our problems in order to become icons of Christ that we're meant to be.
You can summarize it in one word, which is sin. And The problem is that we are oftentimes not honest with ourselves and not honest with God. And so basically, if we're talking about Christian unity, we should try to apply the aspects of Christian living to this problem, and loving God with our whole heart, our whole soul, and our whole mind, and then being honest with ourselves in our failings, and oftentimes, and being honest with ourselves as well in all the positive things that we have from God, and that we can offer back to God and offer to one another. So, just to generalize it, most of the historical circumstances that we can point to, divisions in the church, are because of a misunderstanding. So we have to be open to listening to each other, and really listening, and only then responding. And responding, scriptures say, and there's a good podcast on Ancient Faith Radio. I don't know if I can say that here, but there's a good podcast on Ancient Faith Radio which has the title Speaking the Truth in Love. So we don't have to compromise what we're saying, we don't have to disillusion ourselves, we don't have to be dishonest with ourselves and try to relativize things. We have to be honest to ourselves, but at the same time we can try to be honest to ourselves and to others in the spirit of love and the Christian spirit. So oftentimes we like to simplify things, and for example, there's certain situations in history where we say, there's been a division between the churches, and that's it, it's over, we're not in unity anymore. And we see many cases where people have tried to overcome this and lived out unity, especially in difficult situations in history. For example, when Christians were persecuted, Orthodox and Catholics were able to put aside their differences and say, we are all members of the Church of Christ, and therefore we need to put aside our differences, and we need to manifest this unity, this faith in Christ to the world.
Well, I am a layperson. I am not a scholar by any means. My understanding is partly political history, partly linguistic difficulties, and partly some theological difficulties. Historically, of course, at the fall of the Roman Empire, the East and the West were separated. There were no internet or telephones in those days, so things grew apart. Politically, there was rivalry, of course, between Constantinople and Rome in terms of political power.
I will put it in very simple terms. I think that the way that we got here is due to the fact that our pastors, I'm thinking principally of our bishops, and secondarily also of our priests. But I think that the way we got here is because our pastors gradually ceased to be shepherds and spiritual fathers to their flocks, and they became instead administrators.
The same way that there are people in my family who don't talk to each other anymore, because they stopped calling each other. And because they stopped calling each other, there became the silent treatment. And with the silent treatment, you begin to create stories about the person who isn't there. And then eventually you turn that person into a monster. And then when you finally have this reunion with that person, you realize that you've made a monster out of them, and the person that you hate really isn't the person who's actually there. So we have this problem in that we haven't talked to each other for so long, and the person we think is on the other side of the phone isn't really the person we've grown to hate. So
I would say misunderstanding and miscommunication. Plain and simple. That's what it all comes down to in the end, and that's what comes down to the breakdown in relationships for everybody on every level. When people don't talk to each other, when there's issues that they don't understand, instead of asking questions and trying to understand things, they immediately start pointing fingers and saying, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, I don't like you, I don't want to try and understand you, so it's better that we just separate. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have divorce. We have so many unhappy relationships nowadays, because people just don't understand that differences aren't a bad thing. Differences can be a good thing. And if differences are explored and understood, they can really bring out the best in people.
How did we get here? How did we get to this very sad situation where Catholics and Orthodox are separated from one another, with a breach that we date to 1054? Well, one of the major contributing factors, one of the major reasons, was simply an estrangement, you might say, between Christian East and West. The Roman Empire, from the time when Constantinople was founded by Constantine, as the eastern capital of the empire itself had two halves. There were two languages, there were two cultures, there were two temperaments, there were different characteristics. There was an awful lot of potential for misunderstanding and for friction between the two different mentalities. Now, of course, during the first millennium, there was communion. We call it the era of the undivided church, but there were in fact various breaches between East and West and periods of separation and schism in that first millennium, all of which happily were ultimately repaired. But then, of course, the breach of 1054, which in principle was no more serious than earlier breaches that had been repaired, when that breach was not repaired, then, of course, division gradually hardened thereafter. And perhaps the breach of 1054, which ought to have been repaired, was not repaired because there were substantial changes going on in the background, almost like tectonic plates shifting somewhat. And so we have to say that one of the factors was a lack of sufficient communication from one side to the other. Communication now, of course, is something that we could say we have in abundance. The world has become a very small place, whereas previously Catholics and Orthodox might have been largely able to live their lives and not be terribly aware of one another in different parts of the world, different geographical areas. That is no longer the case. Now, not just with very much advanced communication, but with enormous movements of population because of all sorts of factors in the meantime. Now, Catholics and Orthodox live alongside each other in very many places throughout the world. And combine that with our vastly improved communication now. Now we are certainly in a new place, a new situation vis-à-vis our relationship. And so we can say that now is a time when we absolutely must speak to one another, communicate with one another, endeavour to understand one another, endeavour to appreciate one another, and realise, as was always realised in the first millennium, that even in spite of difficulties and differences of temperament and issues that might arise, nevertheless we are Christian brothers and sisters. We belong together. And so hopefully now we can, in our changed modern circumstances, realise the absolute priority of finding reconciliation, because the world needs our witness. We cannot afford to remain separate and divided from one another. Our reconciliation will be good news for the world. We need it, and the world needs it.
Thank you for watching this program as part of Sister Churches 101, what the person in the pew needs to know about Catholic Orthodox relations. We hope you've enjoyed it and learned something about church unity and the issues involved between East and West. Please visit our website, www.sisterchurches.tv, for more information about these programs, to view more of them online, or to buy CD and DVD recordings of the interviews. Thank you very much.